Doug, thank you for sharing your story so bravely and so confidently and so faithfully. We really appreciate that. For those who don't know, we're in the midst of studying a book called The Story. Working now into chapter 5. Last week, Moses was here. And personally, I want to take a moment to thank him for having given me a break from the sermon last week. I always think it's probably better to talk to the source than somebody who's trying to talk about the source. So I was really grateful that Moses was able to be here with us last week. Learned some very important things about his life and his leadership. And I hope you soon discovered that as he accepted the role of leadership, his life got a whole lot more stressful. When he really dove deep into his faith, sometimes things got really difficult for him. But he made his way through it by holding on to the promise that God was with him. That made all the difference to him in his life. So as he and I continued to talk this last week, he reminded me the story of how he led the people through the Red Sea. You need to remember pieces of the story. The scripture tells us there were 600,000 men who left Egypt that day to begin the Exodus. 600,000 men. Headed to the YMCA? What about the women? What about the children? Oh yeah, the Bible doesn't number them. So you can bet there were over 1 million people who walked out of Egypt when Pharaoh finally said, go. Over 1 million people who crossed through the Red Sea. And the few oxen and lambs and sheep and goats and whatever else they could get going with them and carry with them made their way out into the Sinai Peninsula, into the safety of the dry desert. Finally, they found themselves at Mount Sinai. Traditionally believed down in the southern peninsula of the Sinai, in the southern portion of the Sinai Peninsula, although there's debate as to where exactly Mount Sinai is, but most scholars believe it was way down south. So they traveled from Egypt and went down south to Mount Sinai, and there made a camp. And several months into the Exodus experience, the people began to grumble and groan because they were running out of water. They were running out of food. Different things begin to happen, and God begins to take care of them. But as they camp at the base of Mount Sinai, God calls Moses to go up the mountain. And as Moses climbs the mountain, a great cloud comes over Mount Sinai. The people hear thunder and lightning. They need to know from a literary perspective, writers always talk about clouds descending when they talk about God coming into the midst of the people. Whenever you see a reference to a cloud, know that God is present. The Hebrew writers were very intentional about that. Because God was this sort of unknown deity, this unknown source of being that couldn't be described, that couldn't be drawn, that couldn't be fully understood, and yet that mystery that happens. Have you ever found yourself enveloped by a cloud? It's an amazing experience. It's as exhilarating as it is frightening. So whenever the biblical writers talk about clouds descending, when they talk about thunder and lightning, they're talking about the presence of God coming into their midst. And when that happens, the people run into a problem. For you see, God is holy. God is pure. God is pure holiness, pure love, pure light, pure peace, pure everything. And the people are purely nothing of that. And God understands that the people are so different. And the people begin to understand that God is other. God is something beyond who they are. And yet, this Genesis and Exodus leads us into this sort of study of the struggle between understanding God as something very different from us, and yet God who walks and talks in a garden with an Adam and Eve character. We call that in seminary anthropomorphism. It's one of those $12 words. It simply means sort of putting the undescribable into describable terms. Perhaps in other words, putting God, this unknown cloud-like deity, into human form, who has the ability to walk and talk in gardens with people, who has the ability to speak the same language that Moses spoke, even from a bush that's burning, who has the ability to communicate to Noah what a cubit is and how many cubits wide an ark needs to be. And it's kind of hard to understand whether or not we understand God in that way because that's the only way we can, or that's the way God really manifests God's self. We don't particularly know. But there's this struggle in Genesis and Exodus in particular, but throughout the biblical text, between understanding God as something other than ourselves and understanding God in some sort of anthropomorphic way in our image. It gets even more difficult because when Moses comes down off the Mount Sinai, God says, build a tabernacle, create a tent, a special place where I will come and dwell amongst the people. Wow. The great God, the creator of the universe, is going to come spend the night in a tent. And so in the midst of this camp of over 1 million people with all their tents and all their rugs laying in the dirt, they build a special tabernacle, a special tent where God can reside, where God's holiness can be, where God's otherness somehow dwells with us. It was a difficult time to understand. But in the midst of Moses' life and everything else he had to do, God calls him back up the mountain and gives to him a set of commandments. Because you see now, God, who wants to build a nation, is now working to build a sense of community amongst the nation. So let's take a moment to see a video, sort of depiction of how perhaps that may have happened.
Moses went to the mountain, and God spoke unto him.
Moses, this is the Lord thy God, commanding you to obey my law. Do you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. That man can hear you.
What?
Nothing I want you to forget. Oh Lord, why have you chosen me? What did you have me do for you?
I shall give you my laws, and you shall take them unto the people.
Yes, Lord. Lord, I shall give these laws unto thy people. Hear me! Oh, hear me! All pay heed! The Lord Jehovah, has given unto you these 10 commands!
Okay, so those of us who grew up watching The History of the World, the comedy movie, know that it didn't start with 15 commandments. There were 10. But you know what the heck, it's kind of fun anyway. Because most of us approach the commandments as something incredibly stern. Something that if we don't follow, we get ourselves in trouble. Which is really never meant to be the case. We need to understand some things about the 10 Commandments. The first 4 commandments are really all about our relationship with God. The first is to have no other gods before God. Not to make any images or worship any of those images. Don't misuse the name of the Lord, and remember the Sabbath. In your week, take a day that's dedicated simply to God. These 4 commandments center around building a relationship with God. Because as you'll remember, God is holy, and we are not. And if you're going to be in the presence of holiness, you need to be more like that holy presence. Because in the presence of holiness, in the presence of pure love, anything that is not pure holiness and not pure love cannot exist. It's impossible. And God understood that. That's how people sort of had this sense that you could not fully see the face of God without melting away. That total purity was something you simply couldn't be in the presence of unless something helped you be there. And it was God, God's self, who was helping the people be in the full presence of God and God's holiness. So built for them these commandments that centered in the first 4 about being holy. About doing things and ways of being that would give them the opportunity to be with God. But it didn't stop there. The next 6 were about our relationship with one another. Because in those 6, we have learned that though we might try our best to be holy with God, we don't always live out that holiness with one another. And God calls us to that. Now notice, the 10 Commandments, broken up into these 2 ways, are about 2 important things. Our relationship with God and our relationship with one another. And notice they are not called the 10 suggestions. They are the 10 Commandments. These are ways of living by which God knew we could have a wonderful, peaceful life. But we as human beings don't exactly like laws. Well, okay. We like laws when they pertain to everybody else. Because you see, when laws are set to get people to work in order, my life is more at peace. When all those laws that I agree with are set and followed by all of you, my life is much happier. But God forbid those laws impede my own freedom. Because then I have trouble. But that's where most of us are in most of our lives. Most of us do not like to be told what we can and cannot do. So many of us as human beings are so independent, stubborn, that we like to be in charge of our lives ourselves. But God was teaching the people yet again who was in charge and who set the rules. We continue to question all of that, but the reality is, if the one who made all this world knew how to make it, and knew what rules to set, far be it from us to question whether or not we should follow them. The challenge for us is, what do they mean? And how do we live with one another? How does that all get followed out? But that's a good struggle to be in. See, I like rules, mostly. I hate the road between Phoenix and Tucson. Did you know that I can go 4 miles over the speed limit and not get pulled over? I figured it out. There are rules upon which we have agreed. Rules that God has given to us by which we need to learn to live. The people down below on Mount Sinai, God's up there working with Moses to try to build them in a sense of community, and they're down below what? Melting all their gold and silver and all that other stuff to make graven images to worship because they felt like they needed something to hold on to. You see, these commandments were about unifying the people in their relationship with God and with one another. Because God knew that as God was going to build a nation, God needed to build that nation who would live and work together and have those guidelines, those laws by which they could live. And the challenge for us is to follow them. To discern what they mean in our lives, but to follow them. And that's not always an easy thing for a bunch of pig-headed human beings who want to determine our own destiny and our own way of living. But folks, the reality is, when it comes right down to it, God's the creator. And God made the rules. It's only ours to follow them. Sorry. But no, I'm not. Because I've learned to trust that God knows why. so though I may question sometimes what needs to be done, I learn to do it. You see, as God was leading those people through that wilderness experience, and they were trying to figure out what it meant to have a relationship with God, they also had to figure out what it meant to have a relationship with one another. And the good news is, they didn't have to figure that out. God did it for them. The first 4 deal with our relationship with God. The next 6, our relationship with one another. And I am here to boldly stand before you and tell you that if we did follow Him, there'd be a whole lot more peace in this world. But it has to be about us, not just those others. Oh, we in this country, we so love the 10 Commandments, don't we? We love to build statues and portraits of them. And guess where we love to put them most of all? At the courthouse. Exactly right. We love to put them in the courthouse because if those people would just learn to live by the 10 Commandments, everything would be okay. Forgetting about ourselves. And we Christians love to put those 10 Commandments out there. But are you ready? When Jesus was asked what the most important commandment was, which one did He quote? Which of the 10 did He quote? Kitty? He didn't quote any of the 10. He went back into Deuteronomy chapter 6 and said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. This is the basis of all life, of all laws, because God is about love. That's the foundation upon which Jesus drives us even deeper from what Moses learned about how we can have a relationship with God and how we're to have a relationship with one another based on love. And how do we know? Here we come. Here we come to a table that teaches us how much God loves us, even when we don't follow all the 10 Commandments. And as best we try to make ourselves holy, folks, you will never get there, but don't give up trying. Because your holiness really isn't dependent on you. It's dependent on God. And God will continue to work God's way in your life as you work your way in God's life. So come to this table, a group of people who followed some of the commandments and had broken most of them. And know that you are welcome at this table.